Hi, I'm Lexi and this is Hannah, and we're wild about conservation.
This is the podcast where we explore the world of conservation through discussions with our very knowledgeable guests, and this season's focus is on all things ocean.
In this episode, we chat with Tara about the wonderful world of seaweeds. We learnt that seaweed can be found along the coastlines, but also in more products than we ever dreamed. We also spoke to her about how she came to be a volunteer and community engagement manager for MCS for the whole of Scotland.
Keep listening to hear more about how you can get involved in collecting data on seaweed, the beauty of kelp forests, and everything that seaweed is good for, both in the environment but also out of it. We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast. Please remember to leave a review, get in touch on our socials, and if you would like to help support us as creators, we do have a Patreon. You can check out all of the links in the show notes on our website and the description. Enjoy the episode!
Hi, thank you for chatting to us today. So firstly, could you please introduce your name and your pronouns and just tell us where you're based?
Yeah, so I'm Tara. I refer to myself as she or her. I'm based in Scotland, quite far from the sea, weirdly, given the job I do, but in Stirling, so I can get to the sea relatively easily wherever I go.
Amazing, and beautiful Scotland, always good. And you've definitely led in really well there, Tara. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you're here to chat to us today and where you work?
Yeah, definitely. So I work for a charity called the Marine Conservation Society. I'm here to talk to you a bit about seaweeds and hopefully get some folk a little bit more knowledgeable, a little bit more interested in seaweeds, with the big caveat that 10 years ago, I reckon I would have definitely not taken a second glance at seaweeds. So I am a convert, so I hope to share some of that with you.
That sounds amazing, and I can't wait to learn more about seaweeds myself. But before we take a splash into all things seaweeds, we do have a short game that we like to play with our guests. So it's a really fun quick fire round of a couple of questions to keep you on your toes and hopefully get you a little bit more comfortable chatting to us online. So are you happy to play?
Yeah.
Cool. So firstly, if you could be any animal, what would it be?
I think I'd be an otter, because I always feel happy when I see otters, and obviously they hang out near water, which is where I feel like I'm happiest. So yeah, an otter.
That is a lovely answer. Slightly different tack. What is something that you're grateful for today?
As I'm talking to you right now, I'm looking out on my garden, and I'm really grateful for my garden because I spend a lot of time sitting at my desk at the moment, and I can see all of the wild flowers. I can see our pond that we dug only a few months ago, and I find it so exciting just geeking out and seeing what's living in it. Every day there seems to be something new. So yeah, that's something I'm totally grateful for.
That sounds so exciting. I love it. I love when some part of your own world changes and you can notice that. Anyway, last one from me. What is something that you love that has not a lot or nothing to do with conservation?
Oh, food. Absolutely love food. Yeah, I think in the height of all the kind of COVID lockdown and stuff last year, I just went on all these food adventures. I just felt like I was traveling around the world with food, and I absolutely love that. So yeah, I guess that doesn't have much to do with conservation.
I agree, but it's a wonderful way to experience cultures, like you say. I'm a bit of a foodie myself.
Last week, I introduced Tara and a friend of ours to mochi, which is a rice-based sweet that's Japanese. And our friend compared it to eating a jellyfish.
And then she found a jellyfish on the beach.
Yeah. Finally, every episode, Tara, we ask our guests how they get wild about conservation. So how do you get wild?
So I think as long as I remember, I've really enjoyed kind of noticing the small details of nature. So it could be something as simple as, I don't know, dandelions pushing up in a pavement, or like the massive things, you know, the really exciting things where you just have this incredible day and you see a species that you've never seen before, you know, and everything in between. And for me, it's noticing those details that gives me hope. I love sharing that with people. So as you know, part of my job is teaching children. So I really enjoy the opportunity to kind of help to open people's eyes to some of those experiences, to notice nature. But also with adults as well. I'm quite a keen amateur photographer, so I kind of enjoy finding those details and showing them to people. So yeah, that gives me a lot of hope, and I think it helps me to feel wild about conservation and to feel really positive even when sometimes things can feel overwhelming.
That sounds amazing. And I think you're right. It is that capturing and being able to explain that awe that you see for yourself. And it takes a practiced eye to be able to appreciate the dandelion pushing through the urban areas in which we live, or even to have the patience to sit there and whale watch for 3 hours.
Yeah.
I think having people like yourself that are communicators in that way really, really helps to ensure that not everybody that has the patience to can also experience that mindfulness that comes along with the wild spaces that we have in our world. But I loved your answer. I adored it. But now to carry on with the podcast and learn a little bit more about you. So I'd love you to tell us what got you into conservation, if you can pinpoint a moment.
So I think for like a lot of people who work in conservation who are kind of drawn to this area, all of my kind of earliest childhood memories are around nature. Like, I just remember being really happy in nature, whether that was kind of climbing trees or exploring my parents' garden or going to the beach. Like, I have a lot of very happy memories of being on the beach and swimming in the sea. So I think that's kind of where my passion for nature and nature conservation was ignited. And then as I got older, I got involved in kind of volunteering for different conservation charities. I was very lucky in my teens. I volunteered on Skomer Island off the Welsh coast a few times. And it was just so exciting to be, for the last boat to leave and to be left on the island with a few people who were kind of privileged to stay there, with all the puffins and all the Manx shearwaters and the seals and, whatever time of year it was. And I think it just made me think, yeah, this is what I want to do. I want to work in something where I'm protecting this. It means so much to me, and I could see how important it was for other people. And yeah, I think that's kind of where it all started. Essentially, it's a love of nature, and that's just what fuels me in conservation.
And just picking up on that, Tara, because you're speaking about these wonderful seabirds, have you always kind of, from that moment, has it always been marine conservation and seabirds, or was there something else first?
Yeah, I think I've always loved seabirds, but actually I have a love of everything, every living thing, to be honest. I can get excited about it. I think whenever I learn the story of an animal or a plant or a fungi's life cycle, I just find it fascinating. I think there's fascinating stories everywhere. I think seabirds is kind of where I started out, because I had those opportunities on Skomer Island when I was growing up, and just to be surrounded by thousands and thousands of seabirds is pretty mind-blowing. And if if any of the listeners haven't had the opportunity, I would recommend going, in the middle of the summer, being surrounded by seabirds. It's a mind-blowing experience. Absolutely, like, one of my best wildlife experiences ever has been being surrounded by puffins or Manx shearwaters in the middle of the night. I've definitely kind of gone in different directions. I think my love of seabirds got me interested in migration. So for a while, I was really focused on migratory birds, but land birds rather than seabirds. So yeah, I definitely started, my passion for conservation started through seabirds, but then it kind of moved in different directions. So I've kind of been really committed to islands and also to migration. I guess they've been my different topics. So to the extent that my first kind of proper job out of university was in Mauritius, working on a few little offshore islands there. And the birds there are birds that are found nowhere else on the planet, so they're endemic to these little tiny pockets of the Indian Ocean. And that was really exciting. I find islands quite exciting in that respect, because you've got these kind of weird species. I love a weird species. But then also migration. So I was working for quite a few years for the RSPB, looking after a species called turtle doves. So they barely cross the sea, they're very much a land bird. But I think, again, that theme of migration I just find fascinating, the idea that animals can live in all these different spaces and make these big journeys. So yeah, there's been a few different themes for me, and I imagine there'll be lots more themes in future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like when we hear about our guests and what got them primarily into conservation and how that does in itself migrate and become an entire journey. So what was your route into the Marine Conservation Societies? You've mentioned islands, you've mentioned migration.
Yeah.
Has it always been Marine E then? Have you always stuck to that and then that's what's led you, or?
Not really. I think I moved away from the marine environment. I was working, it was a good 5 years or so when I was at RSPB, where I didn't really do anything to do with the sea. But I think the sea had always been kind of one of my first loves, really. And so I guess I found myself increasingly drawn back to it. And whilst working in land-based conservation roles, I found myself volunteering more and more in different marine sort of roles. So there were some really amazing citizen or community science projects that I got involved with, all about learning about the rocky shore, learning what was there. And really for me, that was where I kind of thought, yeah, this is where my heart really is. So it was a great opportunity for me to kind of learn some new stuff as a volunteer, and then also get some of those skills, get some of that knowledge, so I could then move back into the marine environment, which I guess certainly for the time being is absolutely where I want to be.
And that's so great. I think you just painting such a lovely picture there, and kind of you've already touched on bits and pieces of what it is that you do in your job. Could you just give us a quick overview, because that will lead us nicely, I think, into our next few questions of what your job actually is, because there's lots of different things I know about what you do at the Marine Conservation Society.
Yeah, absolutely. So my job title is Volunteer and Community Engagement Manager. I cover the whole of Scotland, which I love because I absolutely love living in Scotland, travelling around Scotland and working with communities all over the country. So my role is very public facing. So I work a lot with children, so teaching children about the sea to increase their ocean literacy so they understand how important the oceans are and all these important roles the oceans play for us. I work a lot with adults to help them to do the same, really, to understand more about our ocean, to understand better about how to protect it, but also to work together. So hopefully collectively as a network, we can all kind of make a big difference. You know, a lot of us see things like plastic pollution on our beaches, and it can feel overwhelming to see the scale of these problems or to see it on the news. So I feel like my role is partly helping people to work together so that collectively they really can make a difference. So in a nutshell, that's what we do.
I love that. And I think the key word that was running through my mind as you were answering that question is facilitation. I think all of us have the ability to be able to do great things, but sometimes we just need to be shown the way. And that, I think that's what came across to me in your answer, is that you're just a wonderful guide as well as educator on this journey. What do you most enjoy about the public engagement side of your role?
I love those moments where you can see that you've connected with somebody, that something's made sense, whether it's some geeky biology concept that I've been, raving about and really excited about, or somebody, like I was saying earlier, you feel like you've opened somebody's eyes to really appreciate nature in a way they hadn't done before. So that's definitely the kind of softer side of what motivates me. But what I also absolutely love is the feeling of connecting people, because I really believe in the power of communities and individuals working together to have a collective voice. So I think that's something that really motivates me and that I feel makes my job very worthwhile.
I really love that, because I think that's the ethos of our whole podcast, really, is trying to connect people and get people engaged and excited where they share that on, because I think that's a root of conservation, and a really big root of conservation as well. So we've obviously touched on what you do, but it'd be great, because one of the things we'd like to give to our listeners is just an idea of where our guests have come from, how they got here. So I know quite a lot about where you came from, Sarah, but could you give us an overview of your university career? You've already touched on a few different jobs. So just kind of how you got here.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess from a childhood and certainly teenage years, where I really knew that I was passionate about conservation and wanted to make a big difference in this area, I swerved quite a lot in terms of where I wanted to go. For a while, I thought I wanted to be a science journalist because I knew that science communication was really important to me, and I guess I recognised the importance of that. And then I had a complete swerve away from pursuing the kind of journalism side and decided instead I would follow the science. So yeah, I did fairly standard route, 2 biology degrees, so one at Bristol and then a master's at Oxford. And whenever I had the opportunity, I took all of the modules about ecology, conservation, marine, all of those kinds of themes. And for any practical projects, that's what I always kind of drifted towards. But around my academic studies, I did as much hands-on kind of ecology or conservation stuff as I could as well. So whenever in the holidays, I'd always be the one who was off kind of to some island volunteering, whether that was Skomer in Wales or various different places, really. A friend of mine, one of my very closest friends, Serene, and I had the opportunity, we got a little bit of funding to be able to go to Fair Isle, way up in the north, kind of not far south of Shetland. And that was when we were doing our undergraduate degrees. And it was just quite an adventure getting there. It took a few days from Bristol where we were studying. And it was just such an exciting opportunity and adventure for us to go and just meet these people whose whole world was looking after birds, and especially kind of the seabirds that you could see there. And we didn't actually see orca or killer whales whilst we were there, but actually sitting on the cliff tops with people who were sort of telling us, we've had these amazing animals swimming just below us where we're sitting right now. Just really, again, it kind of just continued to fuel that excitement for me about conservation, especially marine conservation. Yeah, and then I think after my degree, so I went to Mauritius. Amazing volunteering. I would recommend it to anyone. The Mauritian Wildlife Foundation do some incredible conservation work. I mean, they really have brought species back from the brink, like hardly any individuals left in the world, and now those populations are doing much better. So I learned a lot. I met some wonderful people, including my now husband. And then I kind of came back to the UK and did some amazing field seasons with the RSPB, kind of looking at birds again. And actually one of the great things I was involved with there was reintroduction projects. I really enjoy reintroduction projects because unlike a lot of conservation, which feels like it can take a really long time, conservation, you're in it for the long run. Whereas reintroductions, you've got these animals and you're releasing them into the wild. And if it goes well, then you can actually see the rewards and really, really quickly. So I had this amazing contrast where I was in Mauritius and we were reintroducing these tiny, tiny little birds called olive white-eyes. Very cute. Highly recommend Googling them. They almost look like cartoons because just around their eyes, they've got this little ring of white feathers. So they've kind of got little googly eyes. And they're really, really tiny. They're the same size as some of the smallest birds we have in the UK. And so we were hand rearing them, kind of feeding them food on using tweezers and things like that. Think absolutely tiny. And then I came back to the UK and within weeks I was helping with a white-tailed eagle reintroduction in Scotland. So the scale was massively different. These white-tailed eagles, their feet were about the same size as my hands. We were feeding them like roadkill and squirrels and things. So there were no tweezers involved. I was using litter pickers, in fact. So, the scale was entirely different. But it was equally fascinating and really amazing, especially the moment where after looking after these eagle chicks for a few weeks, we opened the doors to the aviary and they just flew off. They stretched their wings. These birds had never flown before. In fact, they'd been taken from wild population in Norway where there was a surplus and then released in Scotland. And they just flew for kilometres. They just knew what to do. And then obviously my job was to make sure they were okay in the wild. And that was super exciting, really rewarding, really quite quick rewards for conservation. And then, I worked for the RSPB for quite a few years on a project called Operation Turtle Dove. So turtle doves are one of the most threatened European birds. And that was really interesting because it was all about working together with other conservation partners, people all across Europe, and then into their wintering range in Africa as well. So we were working with partners in Senegal and Morocco, for example. And I found that really exciting, the kind of cultural differences, the need for people from these entirely different worlds to pull together for this small bird who had no idea that we were all working so hard for it. I found that a really fascinating experience, kind of international conservation working. And from there then, like I said, I started volunteering, doing marine volunteering and kind of drifted back towards the marine environment, and hence I'm with Marine Conservation Society now.
That is a lovely journey, and I think I could listen to you speak all day, which is wonderful, which is why you're on a podcast. So you mentioned very early on in this chat that you are a seaweed convert. So 10 years ago, way less interested. What made you a seaweed convert?
So I guess I just always thought the seaweed was the less interesting of the things I could see at the beach. I've always loved rock pools. Who doesn't, right? But I guess I would go to rock pools and kind of move the seaweed out of the way to see what was amongst them. And then it was really through volunteering, through kind of citizen science primarily. Capturing Our Coast was the project I first got involved with, that I started to look at the seaweeds themselves and not just between them and through them and on their fronds, and realised they can be very beautiful. They're incredibly varied. And I guess the thing that I think a lot of people overlook when it comes to seaweeds is if you're walking on the beach, typically you see your seaweeds kind of just very flat, because obviously the sea's left them behind and they've just been left on the beach, kind of two-dimensional. Whereas when you snorkel over a seaweed, it's entirely different, or dive or whatever. And I think for me, it was those experiences of snorkeling and swimming through and over seaweeds and realizing that really they're just these incredible three-dimensional environments, and that you can start to notice all kind of life supported on them. Whether it's like sea urchins or kind of you can peer down and see fish kind of swimming between the fronds. And if you're really lucky, you can see things like seals. I think just recognizing that slight shift in my mind, that they're not these two-dimensional environments. That's only when they're on the beach and when the tide's left them behind. In fact, they're these amazing three-dimensional environments, and there's so much going on amongst them. That's what got me really excited.
You've just painted the best picture of just your change in excitement, because I have definitely always been the person that goes to the beach and I'm like, look seaweed, and people are like, I don't care. I'm like, please, it's great, it's really fun. So just on that note, because I guess for most people when they think about seaweed, they think about this wet leathery thing, possibly. Some seaweeds do seem pretty delicate, whereas some seem tougher. Could you give us a description of what seaweed is?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, seaweeds are incredibly diverse. I don't think I'd fully appreciated how diverse until probably doing the role I'm doing now. I have a prop with me. Hannah will appreciate that I have a prop. So obviously some seaweeds are very leathery. I think a lot of people, if you ask them what seaweeds are like, they'll often describe them as maybe quite slimy. That's how we tend to see seaweeds. So if you ask a child to draw a seaweed, they'll probably draw a seaweed with these bladders, these bubbles on them. That's kind of your typical seaweed. But there are so many other types as well. So they can, as you say, be incredibly delicate. They can be almost kind of paper thin or thinner, and very kind of these incredible vibrant colours, beautiful reds and pinks. There can be these huge leather-like straps of seaweed. They can also be these beautiful pale pink hard seaweeds. So I have one of them with me. Whenever I'm teaching people about seaweeds, they're always really surprised when I show them a particular seaweed, which I have in my hand right now. I found this on a beach up on the northwest of Scotland after a stormy weather. The seaweed itself is called a merle. A lot of people don't realise that you get these seaweeds that are very hard. They resemble corals. Corals, of course, are animals, whereas seaweed are entirely different. They're algae. But this does look like a coral. It's pale pink and very beautiful. And I'm just going to tap it. I'm going to tap it on my mug here just so you can hear. Can you hear that? It's quite incredible, really. It's essentially just got like a skeleton, just like a coral. That's also a seaweed. And we've got a lot of different seaweeds of entirely different textures. And they will feel different as well, depending on if they're living, if maybe they've been washed up on the beach. And if they've been lying in the sun for ages, they obviously can go very crispy and dry. But you also ask kind of what is a seaweed? So a seaweed is an algae, which is a word Hannah's already used. So plants and seaweeds both photosynthesize, so they're able to get energy from sunlight. But an algae, a seaweed, is different because it doesn't have the same structures as a plant. A plant will have flowers and leaves and roots, all the things we're familiar with, whereas an algae doesn't have those structures. It's got other things that do similar roles, but they allow it to be able to live in the ocean. There are some exceptions, of course, about plants who live in the ocean, but I think we'll come to those later.
So yeah, you've mentioned that we've got these seaweeds that are beautiful and amazing and completely different and changeable in their own rights. can you tell me the difference between a seaweed and a seagrass?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously I mentioned that both plants and seaweeds photosynthesize. Seagrass and seaweed are entirely different because seagrass is a plant. Now, I find this kind of mind-blowing because it means it's got all of the same structures of any plant that you know. Maybe you've got a plant kind of on your windowsill or whatever. So it's got flowers, it's got leaves, it's got a stem, and it's got roots that will grow into the sand, into the sediment in the sea. Now, obviously, I am a biology geek, so I get more excited about this than maybe most people, but I think it's incredible for me when the penny dropped and I realised that seagrass has flowers, it's under the water, but of course there aren't pollinators like bees and butterflies under the water, so there's tiny sea creatures like crustaceans that do the pollination for them, that actually move between these flowers. So very, very odd. I mean, seagrass in itself, totally deserves its entire podcast. But yeah, just to mention incredibly briefly that seagrass is certainly a vulnerable habitat. There's lots of really important conservation work for it. It's got a really, really critical role in fixing and locking in carbon. But that's seagrass. Seaweed, like I say, it's an entirely different beast, really. So it's an algae. It doesn't have any of those structures. So instead of roots that can burrow into the soil or into the sand, it has something called a holdfast. I often describe this as kind of like a hand or something that can really grab onto maybe a rock, maybe it's a boulder, or maybe it's the kind of rocky floor of the sea. So it does the same thing as a root. It stops it from hopefully drifting around. Most seaweeds kind of like to be anchored to the floor. And then instead of a stem, it's got something called a stipe, and instead of leaves, it's got blades and fronds. So just a different beast, really, that has a different role in the ecosystem.
You're painting some wonderful pictures, Tara. I'm adoring this episode already. And you're right, seagrass does get its own episode, hopefully.
Awesome. As I said it, I was like, I'm sure they'll be doing an episode on seagrass.
Yeah, I'm excited to find out lots more about that, but seaweed is what we're focusing on. So yeah, I think my next question is just about, you've talked about kind of the fronds and the holdfast and things like this, but are there broad types or classifications or groups of seaweeds?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the first things when you're sort of starting to understand seaweeds, as with any kind of learning about anything in the natural world, you obviously have to kind of learn some generalizations. And when it comes to seaweed, you first have to look at the colors. So you get your green seaweeds. One of the things I love about seaweeds is the descriptions are pretty obvious as to what they mean. So this is always really helpful when you're trying to learn something new. So your green seaweeds are bright green in colour. They're kind of grassy green, and that's because they contain the pigment chlorophyll, just like grass or the leaves of a tree, for example. A lot of folk who are listening may be able to picture green seaweeds. They often occur quite high up on the seashore. You could find them kind of out on the sand and things like that. And there's a really common one called a sea lettuce that a lot of people will have seen. And it just looks like lettuce growing on the sand. So yeah, and then you get brown seaweeds. They can be anything from like browny colours to quite an olivey green. One example, this includes kind of all of the kelps, and one example is kind of giant kelps. There's a really cool fact about these. So they can grow up to 60 metres in length, which I think is pretty amazing because that makes them like more than twice as long as a blue whale. So famously the biggest animal that's ever lived. So yeah, pretty massive seaweeds. And then you get these red seaweeds, and they can be anything from pale pinks all the way to very deep kind of crimsons and even quite dark reds. So yeah, you get these broad green, brown and red seaweeds. And that's how they're split initially.
And generally, I imagine you know a little bit more about UK species of seaweed, but generally in the UK, where can we find seaweed? Is it all over our coastline, no matter what the state of, whether it's a pebble beach or rocky shore? And then what about globally?
Yes, and that's a really good question. So typically it's all about rocky shores. Seaweeds, like I was describing, because they don't have roots, because they have these holdfasts that cling onto rocks, they need to have rocks to cling onto. Makes sense, right? So they live on rocky shores, typically where you've got bedrock, but even where you've got big boulders that don't shift around too much, you can have seaweeds living there. Sometimes you go to the beach and you'll find a seaweed that's made poor life choices and clung onto a rock that's far too small and has kind of drifted off. But typically you do find them on rocky shores. In terms of globally, I think I'll probably have to pass on answering anything beyond UK and UK-like seaweeds, if that's okay.
That is 100% okay. You've mentioned poor life choices, and I've just now become that seaweed in myself, I think.
Nice.
That proper tickled me. The choice of this seaweed.
It's when you see one and when you know it was a baby, it was like, this is a great boulder, this is a big boulder, I like it, and then it grows up and it's like, poor idea.
Just drifting here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because actually that's a really good point. Is there is some seaweeds that kind of just form these big mats in the sea and do just drift here, there, and everywhere. And they can be really important hubs in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, for other animals that are drifting here, there, and everywhere. Which is why seaweeds are so cool. So just thinking about where we're finding them around the UK, we've spoken about kind of on the rocky shore. And you said roughly where we find these green and brown and red algae. As we kind of head towards the deep sea, do we keep finding all of those groups, or does that change?
Yeah, good question. That does change. So as I said, because they photosynthesize just like plants, they need sunlight. So typically you tend to find them as far as sunlight can easily penetrate. So whilst you can find super deep sea seaweeds, I think they've been recorded up to 295 meters deep in the Bahamas. That's pretty abnormal, that's an exception. Mostly they like to be in the lighter zones. And as we know, if you're a keen swimmer or snorkeler around the UK, we don't necessarily have the water clarity of clearer waters elsewhere. So that means that you'll tend to find them in shallower waters. The deep sea, you wouldn't typically find seaweeds. And then I mentioned you find the green seaweeds, things like sea lettuce, typically quite high on the seashore. And then you find your brown seaweeds, they quite like being submerged. They don't really like being dried out too much when the tide is out, so you find them a bit deeper. And then your red seaweeds, they can be even deeper still. That's really broad generalizations, but they have different kind of pigments to be able to harvest the sunlight, and that can kind of allow them to live in different places, maybe where it's a bit darker as well.
Thank you for that explanation. I'm really getting into my mind a picture of like a cross section of a rocky shore and what seaweeds I'm going to find. I live nowhere near the coast at the moment, but I think this episode deserves a trip out. So Tara, how many different seaweeds, UK based, because that's what we're talking about now, how many different seaweeds are there generally in the UK?
That's a good question as well. So there's about 650 species of seaweed in the UK. That said, it's likely there are probably far more that just haven't been recorded yet. It's so often the case, which I'm sure has been mentioned in other podcasts, that often the should we say less charismatic species tend to maybe have just fewer people have studied them. So actually there's often a lot more to learn. So if anyone's listening and thinking, I'd really like to make my mark on science and discover a new species, then maybe seaweeds would be a good way to go.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing the amount of things that we have yet to be discovered, because you have to know what's there before you start to figure out how to conserve it. So there's still so much science yet to explore and so many things yet to discover that I think we take for granted sometimes.
I think that's such a great point there, Lex, about first you have to know what it is to then try and conserve it, to then understand what's happening to it. So there is so many places left untouched what you could look at. But we've talked about seaweed and being a convert. We have yet to ask you the most important question, in my opinion. What's your favourite seaweed, Tara?
It's a great question. So I kind of described this already, but I'm going to give two answers, because when I think about seaweeds, I guess I think of two very different experiences. So one of them is I do absolutely love these kind of delicate pink seaweeds, the ones I've mentioned, things like merle or these coralline seaweeds that they look almost like pinky corals. And structurally, they're so beautiful. They're often quite miniature. So, it's a real treat. You've got to spend the time looking in rock pools maybe to be able to find them, these beautiful coralline pink seaweeds. And they've, just absolutely stunning little things, often with all kinds of other marine life nearby as well. But then I also, on the complete other end of the spectrum, I just love that experience of snorkeling over things like kelp forests. I talked a wee bit about how people think of seaweeds two-dimensionally, because that's often people's experience when they're on beaches. But it is when you're in the sea with the seaweeds that I think you really experience them, obviously as they should be. I love that feeling of when you're swimming over kind of huge kelp fronds reaching up, and you just kind of get this sense of flying over a forest almost. For me, when I'm learning about and thinking about seaweeds or teaching people about seaweeds, I quite like to maybe liken them to being in a forest, because I think that really helps people to understand that you have your kind of understory. You almost have your mossy layer right at the bottom, where you get a lot of kind of sea creatures who are stuck to the seafloor. And then all the way up the fronds of those big kelps, you'll find all kinds of life. Just like if you're in a forest, you might find epiphytes, you might find things like orchids living way up in the branches. Exactly the same for these big seaweeds. And then you'll find obviously these creatures that swim around amongst the blades of the seaweed, the kind of leaf-like structures. So yeah, I just find that absolutely mesmerizing, just really absorbing, and it is just that sense of flying amongst seaweed, which is just amazing.
I want to swim through a kelp forest with you, just so you can explain everything to me.
You should totally do
Just
it.
I'm sorry, I have to pause there. That is a huge thing for Lexi to say. Lexi does not like cold water. And kelp forests are typically in cooler waters. I have to add that. Because when you said earlier about Mauritius, Lex was like,
yeah,
sunshine. So that's a huge gold star from Lex.
Okay, no, that's cool. And I mean, Scotland definitely has the edge with respect to having impressive kelp forests. Definitely not with respect to warm waters.
yeah, it's got highs and lows.
As a slight aside, when I was a kid, until I was about 18, I'd only ever swum in the UK, and I thought becoming numb was all part of the experience of swimming in the sea.
Oh no.
And then in my 20s I went to Mauritius and realised that's not the case, and I found it quite hard to get back into sea swimming back in the UK. I was like, oh, this is what people mean when they say you don't have to experience getting through the numbness barrier. But anyway, that was a total aside, but yes,
See, whereas
I do understand.
If we're carrying on with the aside, I grew up in Spain. So this water is not. It takes a lot for me to want to get into UK water. Learning to dive was one of those things, but generally, every time Hannah's invited me to swim, I'm like, not today, thank you. It's icy outside.
Yeah,
middle of summer, Scotland.
Honestly, right. So Tara, you've done such an amazing job at explaining what your favorite seaweed is, and then the role that they have in our ecosystem a little bit as to the habitats they provide for some of these creatures. But would you be able to go a little bit further into that question and explain some of the ecosystem services they provide?
Yeah, definitely. So seaweeds, as I described, I think if you think about them as a forest, it really helps you to start to understand that they are absolutely integral for an ecosystem. They support so much life. It's kind of mind-blowing, really. I remember reading, I'm afraid this is a rubbish statistic. It's not even an attempt at a statistic. I read a few years ago, though, when some of our kelp forests around Scotland were looking like they were under threat, that an individual kelp can support hundreds and hundreds of other species and organisms. So when you scale that up and you think about a whole kelp forest, it's really quite incredible to realise all of the life and the important role those kelps provide in terms of that 3D structure for animals and plants and other algae to live amongst and in between. So absolutely, I think as an ecosystem, they're just incredible, purely for their biodiversity, purely for their beauty. And I don't think that's a lesser reason to celebrate them. But they also have a huge amount of other important roles. So for example, they help us as humans. So especially these kind of bigger seaweeds, are helping to protect our land, our coasts from erosion and storm damage. Not wanting to bring the tone down, but of course, climate change is a very real threat. We know that storms are more frequent, they're more severe, and also we know that sea levels are rising. So storm damage of coastal communities, loss of coastal communities under seawater is a genuine fear, perhaps more so in other countries around the world. Actually, kelp forests and other seaweeds can really help. They kind of buffer and they protect as these storms come in from the sea, as the big waves come in. Some of the energy of the waves is taken out by those seaweeds as the water moves through them. So they really are helping to protect and buffer our coastlines. They can also play quite an important role in capturing carbon. So again, kind of helping in that, in playing an important role as part of the carbon cycle, I guess, in capturing carbon and to some extent storing carbon as well. So they have all kinds of different roles, I think, and benefits that we get from them.
And just thinking on that, because I keep seeing like ecosystem services is just my jam. But I keep seeing all of these different conversations about alternatives and did you know seaweed was for this? Hey, seaweed's in your toothpaste and all of like these weird and wonderful things. So yeah, could you give us an overview of what seaweed might be good for?
Yeah, definitely. So this is definitely something I found quite interesting in the last few years, was just discovering that seaweed kind of makes it into everyday use for us humans all of the time. Just like you said, you know, the fact that it's in toothpaste, a lot of people don't realise. So everyone listening today has probably already used seaweed without realising it. It appears as alginate, which is something that's extracted from seaweed in all kinds of different things, kind of medicinal purposes, you know. And of course, some people will be aware, you know, some people will know that they've eaten seaweeds. So not even these kind of hidden seaweeds, but seaweeds in the form of maybe in kind of Japanese cuisine. You might have had nori wrapped around sushi, for example. But I grew up in Wales and I hadn't realised that actually it's the same seaweed, nori, that's used in lava bread, the kind of Welsh traditional cuisine. Very different texture to the kind of the drier, more crispy sushi wrapping. Lava bread is definitely much more, I would say, slimy in texture. But then, of course, we also have seaweed in all kinds of other things. So carrageen is a kind of vegetarian alternative to gelatin, for example. So seaweeds appear a lot in our food as well, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. And they have loads of health benefits. They're full of vitamins and minerals and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And yeah, they can be used as fertilizer. For a long time, seaweeds have been kind of harvested by coastal farming communities, kind of taken from the beaches and put on the land as fertilizer as well. So, I mean, a huge amount of very varied uses. And again, I think a lot of people don't necessarily realise that.
I think it's so interesting, the uses that you can find for seaweed when you start looking. Like even just then, as you were mentioning nori, which I mean, I love sushi, but I'm a vegetarian. But I now use nori sheets to make my vegan tuna taste fishier. So you can even come up with some uses.
That is a good tip. So that is good.
Honestly, I'll send you the recipe. It's fab. Right. Tara, in terms of seaweeds, you've mentioned already that you got into it through doing a volunteer project. Was it Co-Coast? In terms of engagement, is that something that people can still do, or can you point us to any other projects that people could get involved with?
So yes. So I'm a big believer in citizen or community science. So that's the kind of science that anyone can get involved with and contribute to increasing our knowledge about often where species are, what species are there, that kind of thing. So citizen science is definitely something that folk can still get involved with. The project I originally got involved with, Capturing Our Coast or Co-Coast, has sadly paused for the time being, but the one that I'd like to talk about today is called the Big Seaweed Search, and that's something that people can absolutely get involved with. So it's done in partnership between Marine Conservation Society and the Natural History Museum in London. And it really is something that anyone can do. It's a really great thing for, I guess, folk who were like myself, who maybe always loved the sea and felt they'd like to learn a bit more. But you absolutely don't need any kind of official science background or training. I think it's very, very accessible, easy to learn, and we've got some helpful resources to help people to do that. It's also a really nice thing to do kind of as a family activity as well, so that, you know, everyone can get involved in rock pooling, but you can actually learn something and contribute to science at the same time.
So if you had to paint a picture of what the Big Seaweed Search is, I mean, I guess the question to start with would be, how did it start?
Yeah, okay, so there's one of the world's leading seaweed scientists, Dr. Juliette Brodie, is based at the Natural History Museum in London. And basically she realised that there aren't enough seaweed scientists for us to properly monitor and understand what's going on with seaweeds all around the UK. And so there's a great opportunity for citizen science to get lots of people involved on their local coastlines, or maybe when they're on holiday, to look at their coastlines, look at what seaweeds are there. Not all of them. I've already said there are 650 species. We don't expect folk to be able to recognise that many, but 14 species that are really relatively easy to learn and to remember and recognise. And essentially letting us know what they find when they go to the beach. It is, in a nutshell, as simple as that. There's some really kind of simple ID help available, kind of useful leaflets, little videos and things to help people get into it. And the reason we wanted to know what's there is partly what you were saying earlier. If you don't know what's there, you obviously can't protect it. But also because, largely due to climate change, we're seeing changes in seaweeds. People like Juliette Brody at the Natural History Museum have sort of anecdotally have been seeing that seaweeds are shifting their distribution. So with warming seas, we're seeing these big brown seaweeds, things like the kelps I've talked about, shifting further north. They don't really like these warming temperatures. We're also seeing, as well as changes in seaweeds kind of where they are, we're seeing new seaweeds coming in, so invasive non-native seaweeds that have arrived here accidentally. Things like wireweed that arrived originally kind of on the hulls of ships and are very quickly and quite alarmingly kind of spreading their way around the coast, and we're not really entirely sure about the impact on local seaweeds, on other kind of species that live there, but they're undoubtedly kind of taking a hold far faster than humans might be able to manage that. And then the other strand is also related to climate change, and that's about these lovely pink seaweeds I was mentioning, the ones often with like a hard skeleton. And those ones are particularly vulnerable to ocean acidification. So another one of these impacts of climate change, where seawater is becoming slightly more acidic, not as much as you or I could feel, but concerningly so if you happen to have a calcium carbonate skeleton, so like a chalk skeleton, which is what these seaweeds have. It's also the same as what like a crab or a lobster or lots of shells, for example, if you're sort of thinking what kind of animals have this. A lot of animals have this skeleton as well. But the seaweeds, you can look for them, and often if they're looking quite unhealthy, these particular pink seaweeds, that can be a sign of damage through maybe ocean acidification. So there's basically a range of species, 14 species, that represent some of those different ones I've just mentioned. And that's what we ask people to look for.
So people go out, they go to the beach, potentially with their family, have a fabulous day, take some notes of what seaweed they find. What then happens with that data?
Yeah, so maybe I should describe in a wee bit more structured than I just did as to what the survey involves. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
So yeah, the Big Seaweed Search really just involves heading to the beach. It's well worth looking at the tide times before you go, because obviously you're only going to be able to see your seaweeds without getting wet if you go on a low tide. For kind of safety reasons, I would always say try and go when the tide is dropping. You don't really want the tide kind of coming in behind you whilst you're engrossed in a rock pool or looking at seaweeds. So then with a pal, with your family, head down to the bottom of the shore, and you've got a list of these 14 seaweeds. You can just download this off our website. And you just basically walk up from the bottom of the shore where the sea's just behind you, all the way to the top of the beach. And you just say whether those seaweeds are present or absent, and whether there's lots of them or not many. And then when you get home, you upload that to the website. And at that point, the data is all sent to the Natural History Museum in London. And they're able to then look at maybe trends in distribution, often because there just isn't much known about seaweeds. If you've gone to your beach, it might be the first time anyone's really looked at what was there. So the seaweeds you've seen might be the first time we've got records for those seaweeds. Even if they're not particularly rare seaweeds, it's still really valuable to be able to find out what's there or what's not there. And at that point, obviously, with more and more information coming through, we can start to look for changes and trends, and maybe recognise where we're having new seaweeds coming in, we're having certain of the seaweeds are maybe leaving particular locations, and that could be a sign of climate change, for example, as well.
That's really interesting. Where that information is going. And Is there any kind of publications that's come out of the Big Seaweed Search just yet? Or kind of, is there a hub that people can go to see the data summarized maybe?
There are a few publications already, and there are certainly more publications in the pipeline, so folk can see where their data are contributing to. If you submit data, you can now see other people's data as well, so you can kind of get an understanding of how your particular beach, your shoreline maybe compares to other people's. But really what we need is kind of more data, more people getting involved, so we can start to recognize maybe trends and patterns. And as with any sort of science project like this, we will always want more data, but more years of data will be incredibly useful, so we can start to recognize some of those patterns.
Because we've mentioned a lot about the Natural History
Yeah.
Museum, which is fabulous that the data gets sent there and a lot gets processed. But what does the Marine Conservation Society do with the Big Seaweed Search?
So our role in Marine Conservation Society is we work with a lot of volunteers. Our volunteer network are called Sea Champions. They're just these amazing, committed people all across the UK who are doing all kinds of incredible things to help the sea, from beach cleans to, you know, talking to politicians and everything in between. Our involvement really is working with our volunteers, supporting our volunteers to get involved with this project, as well as, you know, kind of helping to get other people involved. You know, some of the sea champions who I work with are really passionate about seaweeds and support other people in their local communities to get involved as well. So you can kind of have that ripple effect where, you know, one individual's passion can kind of build and grow. So really that's our involvement, is much more the kind of connecting with communities and with volunteers. So yes, this month, at the end of July, we've got our first ever Big Seaweed Search week, where, so from the 26th of July to the 1st of August, we'll be having a big kind of celebration of seaweed and really encouraging as many folk as possible to get involved. That's quite a good week for the tides. So like I mentioned, to be able to see seaweeds, ideally you need quite big tides. So the times are good, and they're nice big tides, so folk can get to the beach and hopefully enjoy a day at the beach with friends, with family, and do a bit of seaweed surveying whilst they're there. We'll be hopefully helping people to learn a bit more about seaweed during that week, so putting out some information, having, you know, opportunities for folk to ask an expert, that sort of thing, and hopefully just encouraging folk to really kind of celebrate what's on their beaches.
That's super exciting, especially with it being the first one. So everyone, I hope you're putting those dates in your diary. I know I will be keeping an eye on the MCS Twitter and Instagram, which links are in the show notes, guys. And yeah, I think you've painted some beautiful pictures throughout this whole episode. And we are getting towards the end now. But one of the things I kind of maybe want to touch on is how could we protect seaweed? So what could we do to protect all of this glorious seaweed that's all around the British coastline?
So I guess this comes back to, you can't protect things if you don't know they're there. So I think that's why the Big Seaweed Search is really helpful, because it's a great way for absolutely anybody just to get a bit involved, learn something, but also contribute to that science, to understand what seaweeds are living on their coastlines, to maybe start to recognise how that seaweed is changing over time. We know, for example, with big storms, we often get seaweeds kind of really being just torn off the sea floor, and it can take a while for them to recover. We'd like to understand more about things like that. There are also a lot of, you know, very rare seaweeds that folk might be able to spot around the UK that we'd like to have a bit of a focus on in this project. And, you know, if people have tried the Big Seaweed Search and would like to do something a bit more, then that's something we'd like to invite folk to get involved with as well, just so that we can really understand what's there. And that's really the first step to understanding how to protect it as well.
I think that's a lovely note. And I think talking about this type of engagement and this type of project that's actually going on this summer, that if you've got an interest in the sea, if you've got an interest in learning more about conservation, if you just want to try something new, if you get dragged along by a mate that's sea obsessed, just go for it. Absolutely enjoy the day, make the most of it, and you might ignite a new passion. I mean, Tara didn't care about seaweed 10 years ago. Now she's like part of a massive project. Just see where your life takes you. I think that's what Hannah and I have learned from this podcast, and what we've been up to recently is just don't say no too quickly. Try and take some opportunities on board if you can. So one of my last questions for you, I think, Tara, if people want to know more about seaweed, obviously they're going to get involved in this Big Seaweed Search. That's step 1. But what would step 2 be?
I guess it's all kind of involved, connected to each other, but just next time you go to the beach, especially if it's a rocky shore, or quite often sandy beaches will have, some big boulders, they'll have some rocky areas or rock pools. Just take a look, take the time to go and to get closer to it, to lift up different fronds of seaweed and have a look at those structures. It's actually amazing when, I think I described at the start, a lot of children, if you ask them to draw a seaweed or describe a seaweed, they'll describe those seaweeds with the big air bladders. But there are loads of different shapes and structures as well. One of my favourites I didn't even mention earlier, there's a seaweed called thongweed, and when it's just starting out life, it's got these cute little almost mushroom-like structures that grow directly from the rock. I always think of them as like Shrek's ears. I mean, seaweeds aren't typically cute, but actually, if you see these tiny little Shrek ear mushroom-like structures growing out of a rock, I defy anyone to say that's not a cute seaweed. And honestly, that's kind of how I got started, just starting to notice those details and starting to realise that there's all of these different shapes and structures, and then you've got some rather cool, really interesting life amongst them as well. So yeah, I would just encourage you. And whilst the Big Seaweed Search is 14 species, what I always find when you're learning about anything new to do with the natural world is once you learn a little bit, it's much easier to learn a little bit more, and kind of it opens your eyes and you start to realize the diversity and how much just, fascinating stuff there is out there. So I really hope that some folk listening to this might start on that journey and then learn a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful note to be ending this podcast on, of going out, exploring, just having a look, because I have one of those. It's troll hair seaweed. Can never tell you the scientific name, cannot remember. I just know it's troll hair, and then I have to get it and look in a book. But so people ask me and I'm like, it's troll hair. I know what it is, it's that one. But thank you so much for being such a wonderful guest, Tara. And I think that's about us. So thank you for chatting to us, to everyone for listening to us, and have a wild day.
Thanks so much, guys.
Bye. Thank you for listening today. As always, we have been wild about conservation and you have been awesome. Please do leave us a review. We would really appreciate it, and we do read them all.
To keep exploring with us, drop us an email or find us on our socials. All the links are in our description and the show notes. If you enjoy our show and want to support us, we are also on Patreon. Just £1 a month, 25p an episode, will cover our creation costs, and anything above that we donate to charity. Thank you to those of you that are already helping us to keep creating.
Our chosen charity for this season are the British Divers Marine Life Rescue, who are an organisation dedicated to the rescue and well-being of all marine animals in distress around the UK. Donations will go to training teams of volunteers and maintaining specialised equipment that is vital for their work.
Don't forget to look out for our next episode next Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts. If we aren't there, do let us know.
And remember, step outside and get wild about conservation. Bye!
How do you get wild?
Watching wildlife documentaries.
Wildflower painting.
Diving.
Wild swimming.
Ocean watching.
Rock climbing.
Bird watching.
Listening to podcasts.
Hill walks.
Visiting a wildlife charity.